was the night before Christmas.
Went all through the house. Not a creature was stirring. Truth is, not even a mouse.
The stockings were hung by the chimney, which is really great because Santa Claus comes in later. And I probably shouldn't have said that, should I?
The stockings were hung like a bat, because I'm Batman, by the chimney with care in hopes that St.
Nick Fury should be there. Kind of a Marvel Secret Santa Wars type of thing. The children were nestled, all snug in their beds, unaware they were about to be taken.
While visions of sugar plums danced.
Danced in their heads, I guess? I don't know. I wasn't paying attention.
Does anyone know what a sugar plum actually is?
Jamie, pull up sugar plums.
I believe sugar plums are a form of Christmas candy.
Well, Dale, but you have to call me Sugar Plum.
Okay, Dale. We need to move on.
I'm Mom Kerchief, and I'm a cat. I just settled down.
Okay, all right. For a long winter's nap. Outside the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Have you all seen his stuff before? His name is Frank Caliendo. And he sort of faded out of the spotlight recently, not for anything bad, just I think a shtick only lasts so long. But I love a good impressionist. You like when people do impressions? I know like Jamie Foxx does great impressions, and Jay Farrow, if you know who that is, spent time on SNL, also does really good impressions. And they're so much fun. We all love them until someone does one of us, and then we're not usually so happy about that. But we love a good impression. But you know what's really, really cringy is a bad one, right? When someone tries to do a bit or they try to do an impression or imitation and it just doesn't land, it's really, really awkward and cringy. I don't know why. It's not really that big of a deal at the end of the day, but for some reason we've decided that there's nothing cringier than a bad imitation. And so maybe you're thinking here that the simplest parts is kind of in kids' time and in prayer time, talking about masks that we wear and how we pretend to be somebody. You think the pastor's going to tell you to imitate Jesus instead. And I guess I will, but I also think that that's not entirely the goal. I don't think that it's entirely the goal for us to imitate Jesus, because I don't think playing the part is the goal for the Christian. I don't think pretending to be like Jesus is the idea for us, for those who follow him. I think it should be part of our makeup to actually want to be that way, right? Because what's happening in these impression videos is that he's pretending to be a character. But the people that he's impersonating aren't doing a bit. That's just them. And so the goal for the Christian is not to imitate Jesus. The goal for us is to actually embody and to actually be that which we want to be. And the good news is, part of our Wesleyan tradition that I love so much in our Methodist tradition is that we are a faith and a Christianity of both and not either or. So when it comes to imitating Jesus, it is not that you must either be like Jesus or be like yourself. But instead, we believe Jesus invites you to be completely and entirely yourself while also living as Christ. Even though we read passages of Scripture that say, in order to follow Jesus, you must deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow Jesus. That's a discussion of self-sacrifice, not a discussion of your personality or your gifts or your skill set or who God made you to be. To simply believe others are better than yourself, you can do while being completely and entirely yourself. God made you as you are on purpose, and when we live this way and recognize that we all have something different to offer one another, then we begin to see that each of us, including ourselves, is beautiful. And maybe you can see that in your neighbor, but you struggle to see it in yourself. Or maybe you see it in yourself, but you struggle to see that in your neighbor. The problem is that life brings conflict and life brings difficulty that makes our imitation of Jesus become more difficult with the passing day. That sometimes things are just hard. Now, of course, we fall short of the standard of imitating Jesus in the easy moments of life sometimes. But particularly when we face conflict, living like Jesus can be that much more difficult. But even our conflict should imitate Jesus. Even in the middle of conflict, we should see Jesus in there. Because as we've recognized for the last few weeks, Jesus' life was no short of conflict. Jesus' life probably had more conflict than yours and mine. So how can our conflict actually look like Jesus? How can our response to conflict look like Jesus. So far, we've kind of talked about how we can act in the midst of conflict, or how we can even avoid conflict, or how we get through conflict. And today is going to be about how can our conflict imitate Jesus. And oftentimes when it comes to conflict, especially, we focus on two different types of Jesuses. And really in general, I would say when it comes to our faith, we look at two pictures of Jesus and often emulate the one, or we say we're emulating the one, or not the other. We focus on one and not the other. Let me tell you what I mean. The first type of Jesus is what I call table-flipping Jesus. You know the story. Maybe. In Matthew 21, Jesus enters the temple, and there are traders who are selling sacrifices to people to be able to encounter the living God through their ritual sacrifice. But the problem is, what's happening here is that they would prey on the poor, because it's a sacrificial system. And so they would go into the temple, pay for their sacrifice, because they had none to their own name, no animals, no nothing that they could offer for themselves. So they would have to buy from the traders. And they would bring those sacrifices to the temple in order to be able to bring them before God and to commune with God. But these traders were taking advantage of the poor, because they would sell them for far more than the poor could afford, and yet what does the poor have as an option? Nothing. This is their option. And so sometimes we think that Jesus is upset because there's trading going on, there's a marketplace going on in the temple, and I guess that's part of it, but there was a designated space for these people to go actually outside of the temple. It's still there today in Jerusalem. I've been there. And these people made their way into the temple, which was problem one, but not the big problem. The big problem that Jesus saw was that they were being a massive obstacle for people to be able to encounter God. They were standing in the way from people to be able to commune with God. Some people did not have the money it would be needed to be able to get a sacrifice from these people and go into the temple and to pray and to worship. And even if people could afford it, it might have been scraping together every last dollar that they had. And so what does Jesus do famously? He yells that they've turned a house of prayer into a den of robbers, and he starts flipping over the tables and hooting and hollering to kick people out of the temple. And in the Gospel of John, it says he actually chases them out with a whip. This is not the picture of Jesus many of us turn to, and yet we know the story. And I think sometimes, if you're anything like me, we love this story when we throw a good temper tantrum, right? Because we say, well, Jesus threw temper tantrums too. So if Jesus throws a temper tantrum, then I can throw a temper tantrum, and therefore I'm off the hook for my bad behavior. But that's just not the case, because I don't know about you, but very rarely does my temper tantrum have anything to do with allowing people to enter into the presence of God, eliminating obstacles for the poor to be able to encounter God. Very rarely does that happen. In fact, by very rarely, I mean never, not once. In fact, my anger or my temper tantrums or my frustration does way more to keep people away from the presence of God than it does to usher them into the presence of God. So if we're going to use this picture of Jesus as an example in our lives, we better be really, really, really careful when we do and how we do. Because Jesus becoming angry is not an excuse for us to behave however we like. So that's one picture of Jesus. And then we have this other picture of Jesus that many of us prefer, I think, the vast majority of the time. And we may call this Jesus peaceful Jesus. This is the Jesus that's hanging out with kids, telling people to love and to not judge, that love is stronger than hate, and all of these wonderful things. We may think of peaceful Jesus as like hippie Jesus with this countercultural message of love in the face of hatred and in the face of injustice. We love this Jesus. In fact, this is the Jesus we probably should imitate the vast majority of the time, right? Because the example of Jesus becoming angry in the temple is the exception to the rule, and this Jesus is much more the rule when it comes to the way that Jesus lived. This Jesus heals people everywhere he goes. This is the one we identify with or want to identify with most often, because this Jesus is about love and kindness and patience. And there's nothing wrong with any of this, just like there's nothing wrong with what Jesus did in the temple. But oftentimes, we focus on one or the other, and we miss out on the big picture of who Jesus really is. Because if we spend too much time focusing on table-flipping Jesus, then we are going to think that all conflict should be resolved through force. If we just resolve conflict like Jesus, then we need to use force, we need to use anger, we need to use frustration to get our way through it. But if we focus too much on this Jesus that sits around in circles and sings Kumbaya, we will overlook opportunities when we need to be courageous. And we need to stand up in the face of injustice. We need to stand up in the face of conflict. We need to actually do something more than talk to fight for reconciliation. Because this Jesus that we call peaceful Jesus, or that we look at as hippie Jesus, actually isn't peaceful at all. And I don't mean that he doesn't have peace. I just mean that this Jesus is kind and this Jesus is patient, but that doesn't mean that this is the best representation of peace. In fact, Jesus tells us himself that this is actually not the best representation of what peace is actually traditionally supposed to look like. And Jesus tells us this in the Sermon on the Mount. I've been there on a handful of occasions. I brought pictures with me today. There's a church built on top of the traditional spot where the Sermon on the Mount took place. And we think it's here because it describes it in the Bible, and it's actually a natural amphitheater where you can talk at a pretty normal speaking voice, and people far down a valley can hear you talk and vice versa. You can hear them talk back. So it's a perfect place to have an outdoor sermon. And so Jesus uses this for the Sermon on the Mount. It's debated by scholars today whether the Sermon on the Mount is actually one sermon or a collection of sermons. We don't really know. There's actually evidence for both because people were looking for food during it, so it must have been really long. And this is the evidence that we have versus some of the captures of different types of wisdom would make sense that it would be multiple sermons and not just one. And the Sermon on the Mount starts with what we call the Beatitudes. Maybe you're familiar with that word. It's called the Beatitudes because it comes from a Latin word which means blessed or happy. And so you might recognize this from your Bible where it says, blessed are those, or in some translations it says, happy are those. We don't have a direct one-to-one translation of what this word actually means, which is why we hear blessed or happy. And Jesus has revolutionary ideas to say in this that we're going to talk about in a minute. Here it is from Matthew 5, 6 through 10. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I think most of the time when we read this, between the two caricatures of Jesus that we talked about, we see peaceful Jesus here. This is Jesus that we love to hear because he's uplifting the downtrodden, he's uplifting the poor, and he's saying these people are actually blessed because they have a different picture of the world, or a different picture of God than the rest of us. And so we need to listen to these individuals, and we need to serve, and we need to love these individuals, people who are merciful, and people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and people who are pure in heart. And we say, yay, God, I love that message. We all need to feel that way about others. But when we actually pay attention to the passage, when we actually read what Jesus says, and we actually think about the ramifications of what Jesus is preaching here, we may end up with a different idea. Because then we get to a section that we're focusing on today that says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And it's so easy to read this passage that we could translate into our 21st century American context to say, blessed are those who don't stir the pot, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who stay out of trouble, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who don't lose their cool, for they will be called children of God. But that's not at all what Jesus says, and that's not at all what Jesus contends for when he says this. He says, blessed are the peacemakers, which means that peace is not something we can experience. Peace is not happenstance, but peace is something that has to be made. We have to focus on it. We have to want it. A peacemaker then takes action. And yet so often we look at this and think that peacemaker is defined by inaction. But Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, because he recognizes that peace is not the standard mode of operation for humans. In fact, Selfishness is the standard mode of operation for humans. And so peace then must be made in the midst of selfishness, individually and collectively. We must be peacemakers. Blessed are those who take conflict and fight for reconciliation, Jesus says. Blessed are those who see a lack of peace and work for justice. We have so easily comforted ourselves by conflating peace and comfort. And peace and comfort are not the same. We may find tranquility in comfort, but true peace is not comfortable. And we're reminded of this by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who famously said, peace is not the absence of tension, which we so want it to be, but instead it's the presence of justice. If this is not the way of the world, if peace is not our natural way of being, then peace then must be made and peace must be fought for among one another. So peace is not a state of mind. Peace is not pretending like everything is okay. Peace is not passivity. Peace is something that must be fought for and made. So for anything like me, though, if we take the idea that we need to make peace, and then we take the two caricatures of Jesus that we talked about, table flipping Jesus and hippie Jesus, they both feel incomplete. How many times has the temper tantrum that you've thrown ever made peace in your life? Not very often, probably. And I'm also willing to bet that you found plenty of times where trying to sit down and have a rational conversation with somebody has also not brought about a lot of peace in the midst of your conflict. So what are we to do? Are we supposed to go around flipping tables? Are we supposed to just be passive and talk and expect other people to behave then or to respond to our conversation? Neither of these ideas seem sufficient, and I think even collectively, they still don't. I think, simply put, you can feel this frustration as a parent. I know I do. To then go around and to angrily flip tables to try and change a behavior to create discipline doesn't work. And let me tell you, trying to talk through it with a 3-year-old also does not work. And we laugh because it's a funny example, and yet we can recognize amongst the conflict in our lives, we don't change much from when we're 3. Because those same types of behaviors have not gotten you out of the other conflict you might have with adults. So what are we to do? How can we make peace in our homes? How can we make peace in the world? Because according to Jesus and God's kingdom, it's a blessing to bring people together who are in conflict, to fight for reconciliation. But how can we do it when even the pictures we seem to put in our minds of who Jesus is doesn't seem to do the trick? You may have heard the name Daryl Davis. He's a blues musician by trade. He's played with the likes of Jerry Lee Lewis and B.B. King and Chuck Berry, like the greats. And that is actually just probably the second coolest thing that Daryl Davis has ever done. Why don't you check this out?
My name is Daryl Davis. I am a musician by trade, but for decades now, I have traveled the country asking Ku Klux Klan members a simple question. How can you hate me when you don't even know me? To understand someone, you have to talk with them. I never respected the things these Klan members said, but I respected their right to say them. And over time, through the power of conversation, I would help change their minds.
A lot of times we don't agree with everything, but at least he respects me to sit down and listen to me. And I respect him to sit down and listen to him.
Eventually, many would leave the Klan. I have collected over 200 Klan robes, hoods, and other racist items given to me by people whose minds I have helped to change. When two enemies are talking, they aren't fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. That's why we need groups like FIRE to protect our freedom of speech, because without our words, we will never eradicate hate from our world.
Now, I don't know anything about FIRE, so I'm going to hear this as an endorsement, hear it as a way to tell Daryl's story, which is powerful. His goal was not to avoid disruption. His goal was not, well, we make peace by avoiding stirring the pot. His presence in such a place stirs the pot beyond probably what you can imagine. It was not comfortable for him, and it was not comfortable for the people that he was around, and yet peace, bit by bit and conversation by conversation, is and was being made by Daryl. Daryl's goal is not tolerance and acceptance. He doesn't accept what they do or what they stand for. He despises it, in fact. But he also recognizes, if we want to take something that can make our blood boil and make us frustrated, he recognizes that probably going into such situations and taking on the persona of a Jesus that flips tables and chases people with the whip probably isn't going to create the reconciliation that he desires. And then he also recognizes that to stand by and talk about it, to talk about how we can be better, to talk about what needs to happen, to live with passivity isn't going to cut it either. So his goal is not to demonize, but his goal is truly genuine reconciliation of human relationships. And he recognizes that reconciliation isn't immediately achievable. It's not something we can set out to do often, have a conversation, have a cup of coffee, have lunch, do whatever we're doing, and then we're over it. Life is more complicated than that. Conflict cuts deeper than that. Because it's really cool and really impressive that he talks about that he's convinced over 200 Klansmen to quit. But there are way more than that left, right? There are way more than that he couldn't, probably, that maybe he did have conversations with that did not change their way of thinking or did not change their hatred. But he didn't give up his passion for the importance of this issue. He did not give up his conviction by approaching people with care and respect. He channeled the frustration of table flipping Jesus into a productive means by focusing on reconciliation. He recognized that these people also needed the respect of their humanity to move forward, to have reconciliation remain an option. They needed to see that there's a place beyond and better than their anger and their fear and their hatred. And I think based on the Beatitudes, Jesus would say that Daryl is blessed and that he's a child of God because he's a peacemaker. He perfectly embodies the type of peacemaker that Jesus shows us and encourages all of us to be. Because while we created conflict with God by taking the good gifts of life and earth and relationship that God had given to us, we distorted them for our own well-being, for what we perceived to be best for us. We twisted them for our own selfish pleasure. And in the middle of that, despite that, God has always sought and continues to always seek reconciliation between humans, amongst ourselves, and between the human race and God. And the book of Colossians tells us that while we were still this kind of enemy to God, you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. While we were still alienated from God because of our evil deeds, God has reconciled us by Christ's physical body through death. What does it mean to be reconciled with God? What does this look like? How does Jesus create reconciliation out of conflict? More from the same section of Colossians. For God was pleased to have all this fullness dwell in Jesus, and through Jesus to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So, Jesus was pleased to reconcile all things to himself by, meaning through what means? By making peace through his blood shed on a cross. This same phrase we read in Colossians, making peace, is the exact same word Jesus says when he says, blessed are the peacemakers. God creates reconciliation through peacemaking, and he does it on the cross. So when you and I are busy thinking about the type of Jesus that we want to imitate, and the type of Jesus we want to impersonate, when you and I can be busy making excuses for our anger and our frustration by looking at the Jesus who turned over tables, or by trying to avoid conflict by remaining peaceful and taking it easy and talking about things, with little courage to work through the conflict by looking at peaceful Jesus. The most complete picture we actually get of Jesus when we focus on these other caricatures of Jesus. The most complete picture of Jesus the Messiah that we get aren't the two we've talked about already, but instead the best picture of Jesus that we get is Jesus on the cross. The best type of peacemaker Jesus we could ever dream of or we could ever fathom is a Jesus, is a God who is willing to go to such length to suffer on behalf of those who have done harm. The most complete picture and most powerful move of peace wasn't through patience. It wasn't through passivity that Jesus did this. It says Jesus was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace. How did Jesus make peace? Through his blood shed on a cross. It's not through passivity or through great moral teaching or through the Beatitudes that Jesus makes peace. This must be clear. Talk is cheap. Talk ain't enough. Without the cross, all of Jesus' talk is very, very, very thin. But instead, we see a Jesus who puts his money where his mouth is by taking action through self-sacrifice. Because in the cross, both love and justice combine. Humility and glory unite. Power is made perfect in weakness. This is how Jesus makes perfect peace. It's not through calmness. It's not through passivity. It's not through hoping it goes away. It's not through shoving our head in the sand and waiting to pull it out at a more opportune time. The radical, revolutionary, self-sacrificial action of Jesus is what has made peace, because his radical, self-sacrificial action was pointed toward reconciliation. Reconciliation of not just us and God, but of you and me, of all of us together. This is the Jesus of justice and revolution and of conflict resolution, and the Jesus of peace, and the Jesus of love, because they are not incongruent. They are two sides of the same coin, love and peace, and justice and compassion. They're not opposed. They're both necessary in order for the others to exist. So if we're to imitate Jesus, we can't just model the one that we like the best. We can't just model the one that we like the best in the moment. If we are to imitate Jesus, let us imitate the Jesus that is willing to go to the cross, that we might be reconciled. We can't only model the Jesus of kindness and patience, or only the Jesus who angrily turns over tables, because kingdom peacemakers embody both of these attitudes. And where do we see these attitudes put on display the most? We see it on the cross of Jesus. And so if we seek to live in peace with one another, it is something that must be made, and the way that it is made is by you and me going to the cross for our neighbor each and every single day, that they might know the peace of Jesus, that they might know the peace that's being made on the cross, and the peace that we experience through the empty grave. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we believe all these things. Amen.